All right, welcome everyone. So we just have about a few more minutes, well, one more minute until the top of the hour, but we'll just let a few more minutes go by so that we can have everyone join us, and then we'll get started.
Thank
So
you.
while we wait, if you are not familiar with this platform, there is a chat here. So go ahead and let's test it out. Drop in the chat where you're calling in from. I'd love to know where everyone is. Michigan, nice.
Yay,
I'm
it's cold
over
up there.
here in New York. Anyone else in New York? I know Anna's here in New York.
Hi, everyone.
Anyone outside of the United States, just out of curiosity?
Mexico. I don't know if you guys saw that storm in San Diego. That was intense. It was a rainstorm. Yeah.
Yeah, anyone from San Diego? You could just drop in the chat where you're calling in from. We'd love to know. All right. Well, shall we get started? Okay, so I'm excited to welcome you all to our webinar today, Diversity in Clinical Trials, a new perspective based on FDA requirements and translation in partnership with Formacon Global. I'm Samantha Gerasi, Director of Business Development for Formacon Global. And today we have two fabulous speakers, Sarah Tylofsky, CEO of Formacon Global here, as well as Anna Eisenberg, the Director of Life Sciences for MorningSide. So in today's discussion, it's designed to provide you with a fresh perspective on diversity in clinical trials, aligned with the latest FDA requirements and translation best practices. So this webinar is planned for an hour, and we'll leave the last 15 minutes dedicated to your questions, and we'll get you answers. So if you'd like to submit a question, you can use the panel that's provided with GoToWebinar. You'll see there's a chat, handouts, questions. You can just click on that, submit those questions. We'll be monitoring the panel of questions throughout the duration of the presentation, and we will answer them at the end. So without further delay, I would like to pass it over to the amazing Anna Eisenberg. Anna, go ahead, take it away.
So I just want to say at the beginning a few words about MorningSide. MorningSide is a full-service language solutions provider. We are specializing in life sciences. Founded in 2000, we were acquired by a French company, Questel, in 2021, which expanded our global reach. We are now in 38 global locations, including US, Europe, Asia. We service a wide variety of life sciences businesses, pharma, healthcare, medical device, and we work with various types of businesses in life sciences, from very small biotech firms to quite large global brands. So I'm happy to hear from Sarah, our panelist, who will tell us about diversity in clinical trials. And then at the end, I will talk a little bit more about translations as part of the approach to diversity.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. So we are very privileged to be here with this group at MorningSide, and I just want to share briefly about Formacon Global. We basically have been a leader in accelerating clinical trial projects focused in Latin America and also diversity. So that means that we're basically providing a robust support for startup, including guidance about regulatory, which is where Anna's group comes in, and then some very comprehensive training solutions. Our differentiator is that we have a network of doctors that are experts, have all been either past principal investigators or they're key opinion leaders, and they know how to make things happen. So from really end to end, regulatory to enrollment, that's our main gig, is to get the enrollment, which we know has been the huge problem in clinical trials. 80% of trials don't enroll on time because they don't have enrollment. So by offering diversity in Latin America, this is how we're able to really fulfill a lot of our client needs. Super. So I think today we'll go ahead and get started and talk about diversity. I found this slide really cool because, recently I looked at a National Geographic show about genetics, and we all came from Africa. I find that really interesting. And then as you see over time, evolutionarily, we've all diversified. And yet, that's what makes us to be very unique people. And now we are trying to represent better diversity within clinical trials as a goal, both globally and in the United States. So this slide to me represents who we are as a world. And so the FDA has had a goal for many years, but the goal really was put more succinctly in November of last year, where they really are recommending, it's an act that's gone into law, but they really want to get more of underrepresented racial and ethnic groups into the US, primarily with African American, Asian, Hispanic, Latinos, Native American, Pacific Islanders, to really figure out how to identify the different effects that different people will have on a new drug or a new medication. I mean, it's interesting if you think about it. Back in the old days, these trials started out with white people, then we added women, and then we added kids. And so we're slowly getting down the food chain of diversity, but we have a very, very long way to go. So this is the FDA's goal. And in fact, the FDA is now recognizing, I found this very interesting, on the FDA website, you can find these various languages that are available within the United States. You have Arabic, Cherokee, Simplified Chinese, Traditional Chinese, Spanish, French, Hindi, Korean, Navajo, Filipino, and Vietnamese. And I highlighted here the Spanish version because that is where our bailiwick lies. That's where our focus lies. I mean, we all have these niches in our worlds of clinical research, and ours is really focused on the Spanish populations across the globe. So there was a public law passed within the United States, and basically it's requiring these diversity plans that at least the phase 3 trials that are being conducted have. And that's also true for medical devices and diagnostics that use the 510 pre-market approval, and of course, investigational device exemption pathways. So overall, the FDA is very, very excited to see diversity plans in the enrollment for the late phase trials. And why the phase 3? The phase 3 trials is really where the rubber meets the road. You've already gone past the safety, you've already gone past the efficacy, you found out what works in terms of drugs dosing or in terms of the device, if it's got some efficacy. And now you have to go to a much larger number. It doesn't matter if it's even a rare disease trial, can have maybe 30 people globally, but they want to see the larger numbers, and that's where they really want to see the diversity. So it's not in, it's a law, but it hasn't been implemented yet. So it's a really important thing for all pharmas and CROs and service companies to be aware of this, because it's just going to roll out to be a more important tool as we go into 2024 and beyond for these larger phase 3 trials. So basically, the FDA is planning to and has been reviewing these diversity action plans for clinical research projects. So I have a question, and if you want to type your answer here, great. My question is, if you're a biotech or a pharma or a CRO, have any of you been able to submit these diversity action plans to the FDA? Yes or no? Very simple question. Okay, so I'm asking those, am I asking the right question here? I just want the answers. Questions. I'm having difficulty here. Okay. And am I asking, am I doing it in the right spot here? I don't know. I'm not getting any answers.
Yep, you're good. There's someone saying that no, they haven't.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. Okay, and so basically, the FDA also wants to work with foreign regulators to facilitate that piece of the regulation, including using decentralized clinical trial tools, which I know that's been something that's been implemented more so in the clinical trial space. So this is kind of a fun and maybe controversial slide, and maybe you can help me, Samantha, with the answers to these. But you know, Hispanic versus Latino, a term mostly used in the U.S. It's interesting to me, and I've been in this business a while. Whoops, there we go. That people don't know the difference. So just say yes or no. Do you know the difference without looking at the answer here between a Hispanic versus a Latino? Or let's make it an easier question. Raise your hand if you're considered a Latino or Latina, or raise your hand if you're considered a Hispanic, and then we'll just move on. So this woman, Kat Lazo of Bustle, you can find her online. She is, I believe she is from Brazil or no, she's from Colombia, and she was very frustrated that people didn't understand the difference. So I'm just going to explain it here because it is important. So if you're Hispanic, you're from you're Spanish speaking people or origin that's connected directly to Spain. And so Spanish people also obviously can be from Spain, but it doesn't include Brazil. Whereas if you're Latino, Latina, or Latinx, they call it, your origin or ancestry is to Latin America. So that was because of the colonization of both Portugal and Spain to those countries. It includes at least 26 countries. It has to do with a geographic location, and it doesn't include Spain. So the reality in the United States is we have a lot more Latinos and Latinas than we do Hispanics, for obvious reasons, because it's right next door to the United States. So that I thought was important, because in the early world of the FDA, everything was Hispanic, but we've learned now that Latino or Latina is really the more appropriate word and more commonly used especially for clinical trials, because people are mostly from the Latin American region that are either in the US. So what about understanding the state of affairs for clinical trials for Hispanics and Latinos? I mean, it's pretty sad story, to be honest with you. So a little more than 5% of adults in the US that have participated in a clinical trial are Hispanic or Latino, or excuse me, have participated in a clinical trial. And of those, they're white. Whereas if you look at Latinos, if you look at actually the most recent data, this is actually census data, but it's more like 25% of the US population is Latinos, and yet only 4% have been in trials. So if you do the math, it's very, very, very tiny. And so what that means is that even though the Hispanic Latino population constitutes the second largest racial group in the United States, it's actually more than like 60 million people. There's such a tiny amount that are actually in trials. It's a sad state of affairs. So that's the facts. And then this, I'm not going to get into this too much because it's a hard slide to see. But if you also look at active physicians and the Latino breakdown, it's a tiny percent. It's a very tiny percent. The big one there is the white people. And the other problem that's going on in clinical research specifically, and then on the right is the further breakdown of the Latino doctors. The other problem with that is that most Latino doctors are really busy being doctors. They're really overwhelmed by just taking care of patients. And so clinical trials being its own animal, they just haven't seen the opportunity to even go into that field. About 10 years ago, I was out in the field trying to find Latino doctors doing clinical trials, and in the entire country, I found 10. Now it's probably more like 100, but still, it's a very low number of Latino doctors that are in the clinical research space, let alone treating patients. Next slide. Here we go. This is also a great slide about just a global perspective on diversity. And you look, what it's giving you on the one side is the population, the percent of number of trials, the percent, and then diversity comment. One thing a lot of people don't know is that the United States is maybe the only country, and if you know any different, let me know, that actually pays patients for their time. No other country pays patients for their time. They consider it unethical in those countries. So that may be one of the reasons that we have so many clinical trials coming out of the United States compared to, but in addition, because the FDA has been considered the top dog in the scheme of regulating and running clinical trials. But just go down the list and let's focus in on the Latino piece. If you look at Brazil's pretty good sized country. It's more like 230 million now. And it only has 2.9% of the total of their population that are in clinical trials. And yet 42% of their population, it's actually higher now, has African American descent. So we need to have Brazil in the mix. Hello. Mexico is another great story. It's actually more like 140 million. It only has 1.26% of the total are in trials. And the other interesting point is that you look at the United States, US Latinos, 63% are Mexican descent. Obviously, it's our next door neighbor. So these are important points to look at it from a global perspective. And just a comment, Colombia, kind of a similar story, really small percent, also a larger group of African American descent. So quick question here, and maybe Samantha can help with the answers. How many of you have conducted trials outside of the United States? Just a raise of hand.
Oh, you could put it in the chat if you have and where you've done it.
That would be great too, yes. Are we getting any answers?
No.
No. Uh-oh. Oh, well, diversity is definitely an important point, and this is to just give you some global perspective on diversity. Next slide. So, what race do you belong to if you're Latino? This is another interesting point, that most of the Latinos are a mix. They're just a mix. This is what it is. Even, Black people in Brazil, they're a mix. So again, this is to give you a perspective within Latin America about that. That's all over the map. It goes back to my original point that our genetics are coming from Africa. So we're all a mix of something. So again, understanding the state of enrollment in clinical trials in the US, there's many barriers that are creating this problem that the FDA wants us to do something about. And there are several barriers that are limiting enrollment for Hispanics and Latinos in clinical trials. So there's a lack of awareness, which that's probably the biggest one. Fear of side effects, being uninsured or underinsured, low socioeconomic status, transportation barriers, lack of access. I can remember that I was involved in a project with UCLA, and they wanted Latinos, which live right next door. I mean, they're right there in Los Angeles, but because the entire center of the principal investigator and their staff, none of them spoke Spanish. They didn't have any Spanish materials. It was very, very difficult to, attract Latinos. And of course, another big one is mistrust, because again, birds of a feather flock together. If I speak mostly Spanish, I would be more likely to want to go to a Spanish speaker. And then let's continue with these whole points. So the pharma and the biotech industry have also minimized their own costs by using their same sites, the high enrolling centers, which tend to not be minority serving institutions. All that's changing. It's slightly changing. Certainly in the African American community, it's getting better, and in the Latino community. But disparities still exist, whether they're, industry or government funding, and then have things in protocols that create confounding variables. So age and sex is one thing, but then you have race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, medical history. That gets complicated very quickly in a protocol and when you're trying to screen patients into a trial. And so it's normal with humans going to the least resistance pathway, and that oftentimes is their own network, their own database, their own referring physicians. And so it's a big effort to do something outside their own box of trials. So what's the implication? Well, it's sort of obvious. This is why the FDA is concerned. It's hard to generalize into the general population because of these diverse cohorts that exist to say, well, this product could be working very differently because of the way things are metabolized. I mean, just for example, Mexico and Mexican Americans are much more prevalent to have diabetes. It's partly their genetics. It's like they have this bucket that's 3/4 full, then they add some Coke and some sugar, boom, they're off to have diabetes. So we don't know how these products will work on different people because of their metabolic pathways are different, and of course the prevalence. And so we definitely need this adequate representation of the different genetic profiles and even socioeconomic differences that can affect the way a product works. And so what are some strategies to increase clinical trial diversity? In the United States, obviously, this is something that's finally happening, and this is where something that Anna's group is coming to the table, and that is providing different language materials. And it's done in the moment, like in the moment the study is getting approved, then it can go in parallel with the English speaking materials. And that I've seen that as a change that is starting to happen globally and certainly in the United States as well. And then another thing that's happening is to work with more community organizations, patient advocacy groups, community health centers, these promotoras that are on the ground. There's been a very specific examples with these centers, and they've had great success, like the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in New York that has done this outreach very specific to the Latino population. The other thing that's working in the United States is social media outreach. There's a lot of Facebook groups now that are diversity oriented, and that has some impact. The problem with that is it creates awareness, but the actual patients that get into the trial is really still very small. There's still that lack of trust. And then, of course, addressing logistical barriers due to economic disparities, such as providing transportation, providing translators on site within a site, having the study coordinators have somebody there that can translate in whatever language. You saw all the languages we showed at the beginning. So these are just some of the strategies that can be used to increase diversity. And since no one has said that they've had diversity in their trials, I'm hoping this is new information for you. And then another point which we talked about earlier, which is super important, is that we need to increase the number of Latino doctors to train into clinical research opportunities. This is, again, just starting to happen a tiny bit, but it's a huge opportunity. And it's probably an easier place if you represent a CRO or if you represent a biotech or a pharma. It's probably an easier place to start. Even though direct to patient is really a wonderful thing to do, you're going to have more success because of that trust factor of finding those doctors who already have a database of patients, who already are in the field seeing patients, or have doctors they work with that can make that happen. This is the same thing with KOLs. They have better access, key opinion leaders, and then to work with medical associations like the National Hispanic Medical Association. Within NIH has a lot of programs that are diversity oriented towards doctors. And then of course, embrace decentralized clinical trial methodologies that we've seen as great tools as well. Now, what can we do in the global market? And again, Anna alluded to the fact that they're in several countries now. So one way to provide diversity for the Latino population is to pick several Latin American countries to perform an analysis and get that disease prevalence. Remember, we talked about how Brazil and Colombia have a high prevalence of African American genetics. So that's a great place if you're needing African American and Latinos. It's like two birds with one stone. And so that assessment is very, very important. The other important thing is to understand the regulatory overview and the timelines. This has been something in our experience that people have been afraid to attack because they're like, oh my God, it's going to take forever. But if it's done in parallel with the plan of enrollment, then it's not going to be so bad, because instead of getting trapped, oh my gosh, I have no enrollment, and then, well, maybe I can go to Latin America because we know there's a lot of patients. If that whole plan was started out right out of the chute, then you're going to be much better off. You need to also understand the logistical concerns of bringing product into foreign countries like Latin America. You want to identify key opinion leaders, centers of excellence. The model is quite different globally than it is in the United States. In the US, you have a lot of private facilities, but in other countries, there's a lot of large centers because they're public centers. And those are also great places to have clinical research sites. The bottom line is you want to develop an enrollment plan early. The outreach can be similar to the US, but obviously more focused on doctors than with patients. So that's what we've seen to be very, very successful to help increase enrollment and increase diversity for Latinos specifically. So this is just more of a perspective on clinical trials in Latin America. Yeah, about 3% of worldwide trials are actually in that space. And you can see that South America is more likely, which would include Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Chile. Those are the larger countries where we've seen more clinical trials take place. Mexico obviously is a large piece of it, but it can grow significantly. And Central America is a smaller piece. The bottom line is 3% of all clinical trials in Latin America is very small. So there's a huge opportunity to grow. So in conclusion, I mean, I ended up being a little early, but that's okay. Everybody likes to get their time back. So in conclusion and takeaways, access to clinical trials is really a challenge based on who's running the trials. And in the case of the United States, it's mostly white doctors. Again, it's changing, but it's got a long way to go. And diversity can be fulfilled by conducting more trials outside of the United States, especially Latin America, where the largest Latino population exists, and the third largest African American population exists. This is something that people just do not know. Some of the larger pharmas are aware of that, but if you're a biotech or a CRO looking to create some diversity, that's the place to go. The other point to really fulfill the goal of the FDA and of course of the companies that are selling these products is to make a plan early in the planning process that will help fulfill the diversity needs. It will also increase enrollment significantly. And instead of waiting, always plan it early. This has always been our mantra. And then of course, decentralized clinical trials where you can have the virtual enrollment. We saw how COVID was able to provide that tool. And it's been a slow upstart from our experience. Hasn't gone as quickly as we all thought it would, that everybody's going to enroll on their mobile phone. It's always more complicated because these clinical trials are all very unique. But that's also a way to increase diversity so you can reach to people in either difficult areas, rural communities, or in areas that maybe there's not, the PI doesn't exist, but there's these communities of Latinos. So that's another great tool to make that happen as well. So I would, yes, pass it to Annie. Thank you. Or go ahead, Samantha.
Oh, Anna, go ahead and take over.
I just wanted to tie in a couple of slides about MorningSide and about what we do to the whole broader point of what Sarah was talking about. Communication is key in clinical trials, whether we are recruiting the patients, explaining to them what's involved, and particularly here we talked about Latino population where there is a stigma about clinical trials or lack of access to facilities. All of those areas represent a different culture. And using Latino population as an example, I could say that in various markets, when we provide translations, we have to definitely take the cultural aspect as one of the important points of translations, as well as obviously when we approaching patients, you know, we have to make sure that texts are created a certain way, that they are accessible and clear to a patient, which is an average reader. You know, there is a lot of medical terminology. There's a lot of very important information when we distribute information on clinical trials, but we want to make sure that patients understand it and understand what they are participating in. So that's one aspect of translations. Another one is, of course, cultural, nuanced information. And the third aspect is that apart from the written communication, we also provide interpretations, which are becoming a bigger part of enrollment, especially, for example, in the US, when patients come to the doctor's offices and they don't speak English, they need to have a certain opportunity to communicate with the doctor to understand what the trial is about. In rare diseases, it becomes even more important because the circle of patients is limited. So whatever patients are available, even if they don't speak the language, they need to be approached and become good participants. So what we provide is obviously we have interpretations on demand, but a more widely used is over the phone interpretations nowadays, and we provide it in doctors' offices, in healthcare facilities. Also, we do projects where we have educational outreach webinars from various organizations which promote different knowledge about different diseases. You know, it can be allergy and asthma, it can be diabetes, cancer, you know, where the audience for the webinars may be bilingual, you know, where we interpret the speaker, whether it's an English-speaking doctor or a Spanish-speaking doctor, so we can kind of cover a wider audience of patients. So for people who deal with clinical trials, and I would let you on to the point Sarah mentioned at the beginning, that primarily translations are used in phase 3 and 4. of the trials, right? When we go to wider population, when we have global trials in some cases. So a very wide variety of documents needs to be translated for the patients. Of course, it is an informed consent form, legal documents which all the patients have to sign, and they have to understand all the details of trial participation, of what they're getting, and you know, what the safety, warranty, other types of concerns they may be. It can be patient diary, patient recruitment letters, clinical study summaries are very important because obviously patients are not able to read the physician's protocol, which is written in a very scientific language, patient questionnaires, and at the conclusion of the trial, it can be patient-reported outcomes, discharge letters, various types of HIPAA authorizations if we're doing the trial in the US.
Mhm.
You can take it away, Samantha. That's exciting news.
Yes. Amazing. So that was awesome. So I think we're going to get to questions momentarily, and lots of great questions are coming in. So if you have a question that you want to ask, go ahead and drop that in. But in the meantime, we have some exciting news to share. We've been nominated as the best clinical research for the Best Clinical Research Organization Award for the 17th Annual V Awards at the upcoming World Vaccine Congress in Washington, and we'd love to have your support. So we're gonna drop in the chat the link, the direct link to a vote for that. And then there's a lot of other great companies being nominated as well there. So go ahead and yeah, so that will be dropped in the chat momentarily. But in the meantime, I'm gonna start asking these questions here.
Great.
All right, so I think this question is for Sarah here. So to clarify, is the FDA regulation guideline on diversity coming, or has it already been approved and implemented?
That's such a great question. And you know, it's been a discussion. It is a law, but it hasn't been implemented. So it's more now that the FDA recommends to have a diversity action plan. And for sure, if you have a phase 3 or phase 4, as Anna mentioned, trial, and you're, you know, applying to the FDA, you better have some diversity in there or there will be pushback. So it's not like it's in writing yet, even though it's in an act and it's been more the interpretation, but it's not like they're going to completely say you have to have it. It's a recommendation at this point, but again, you will get pushback when you submit a trial that has no diversity.
Great.
Great
Okay,
question.
another follow-up to that question is, do they also want diversity with medical devices, or is it just pharma and biotech?
No, also with medical devices, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so do you consider, oh, this is a really good question. Do you consider the regulatory rules in Latin America as a barrier for diversity? Could you share some experience about that?
That is a great question. So the answer is no, I would not consider it a barrier at all. Because if you look at the genetic profiles of Latinos in Latin America, they're going to be very similar to the Latinos that live in the United States. And as a matter of fact, we just are now have contracted with a major pharma that is going to Brazil, and they already are, and Brazil and Colombia, because they know they can get, as I said before, 2 birds, 1 stone, Latinos and African Americans. So the short answer is no, it's not going to be a barrier. And yes, it's a great option. You just have to embrace it as an option. Now, that doesn't take away from the fact that you want to do things in the United States as far as reaching out the Latino population, all those strategies that we discussed, but it is a really great option. And in fact, if you look at the markets in Latin America, like Mexico, like Brazil, they're good markets. So you should be there anyway, diversity aside, in a large trial.
Okay, so this next question, So it says African Americans are only in the UN, outside the US, as people are not American, they are people of African descent, correct?
Right, it's a good question. Again, that's up to interpretation. If you think about the Americas, you know, we all think we're so special being in the United States of America, but the Americas include Latin America, South America, United States of America. So technically, African Americans would also be included in South America.
Okay, so next question, how can we develop a better trust within person events if we currently do not have the specific demographic, like Black events, Latino events?
Well, that's a great, I think I understand your question. I mean, what it boils down to is you want to be able to have your on the ground community groups that a lot of companies, including ourselves, including Anna's, can help facilitate that outreach within a given community. And this is why I said earlier that the faster, better, easier way to start, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, is to start with the doctor, because in the food chain of life, we all have to go see the doctor, whether it's a clinical trial or whether it's a medical problem. So if we can have more African American, Black doctors, more Latino doctors in the US, more Indian doctors, more Asian, more Chinese, all those kinds of doctors doing clinical research, they already have their patient load. They already have their people. Yes, it's going to take time to turn those doctors into clinical research sites, into PIs, but they can start with being sub-investigators. They can work with doctors who already are of an ethnic origin and just want to be a sub-investigator, which means they're going to learn as they go and they don't have to have this huge infrastructure. And that's something we've helped in the United States to do, is to identify, in the case here, of Latino doctors who want to get into the business but don't have a clue how. We can help them do that. I don't know if that answered your question. It's a little bit indirect, but it's not, starting with those community groups is a great place to start, but you have to have those connections first.
Okay, great. So this next question, I believe, is for Anna. So how do you know what to look for in a translation provider?
Well, I think that what you have to look for is an experience in life sciences, because life sciences translations is slightly different. I mean, of course, it's all documents are translated by native speakers, but in life sciences, we also look to be documents to be perfect, and it has to be 110% perfect, because we're dealing with human health, and one little mistranslation can affect a very wide population and can create all sorts of serious issues. So majority of life sciences translation providers are ISO certified. So you will be looking at the certain level of certifications. You will be also looking at the ability of understanding that the documentation is going to patients versus physicians. I talked a little bit about it. You know, obviously the physician-facing documentation is more scientific, more complex. The patient-facing documentation has to be done at a certain reading level. In case, for example, of Hispanics, Sarah was talking about socioeconomic issues, that not all the people have a very high level of education. So we have to be able to explain to them the intricacies of the disease, the side effects, the implications of participating in the trial, and the benefits of participating in the trial, all of it in a clear language, with maybe more simplified sentence structure, more simplified grammar. And, you know, in some cases, we also have to bring in the dialects, right? Since we were talking about various Hispanic populations, you know, yes, it's Hispanics, and the difference, for example, between Hispanics and Latino right away. Brazilians don't speak Spanish, they speak a Brazilian version of Portuguese. and we have a variety of different dialects within Latin America. Some of the words may be even different, explaining certain things. It may be, I don't know, a certain fruit can be called a different way or something like that. And there's a very wide variety of dialects, and on that level, the dialects will be important because we're going to the very conversational communication level, and that's where the dialect will be important. So these are, I think, the two areas, the certification and the ability to work with various types of life sciences documents.
Okay, so a follow-up after all that amazing information. When is a good time to engage a translation company?
The earlier, the better. Of course, we like to work with final documents. That saves time and money. But when you're planning a clinical trial and you know you're going to be enrolling foreign-speaking patients, it's a good idea to discuss with translation agency how you're going to even write your materials, because in some cases, some cultural nuances have to be taken into account, how you're going to structure your information for certain groups of patients, how, as an example, how you're going to maybe approach children in the clinical trial versus approaching their parents. This is where the cultural nuances will be key. And I think the earlier the better, it's good to discuss. The other aspect, I think, which is important to take into consideration, that if you're designing a lot of materials kind of from the same base of content, if you have certain repeated information between the materials, you want to get the leverage, both in cost and time. And if you know that upfront, this information will help you, in planning your translations.
Okay, so we have a few more questions here. I think this one's going to go back to Sarah. But of course, Anna, if you have anything to add, feel free to do so. So Sarah, would you agree that despite regulatory hurdles in Latin America, these challenges are counterbalanced by exceptional recruitment rates, particularly in rare disease and oncology trials? And then there's Latin America is usually not considered in early planning. So
Yeah,
would you agree
that's
on
my
this?
favorite. That's my favorite question, actually, because we get this all the time as a company that operates with our partners in Latin America, and that is because there are lots of people down there, about 660 million people that reside in the Latin American countries, maybe a little more now, and it's in the similar time zones as the US. So there's this huge advantage for US companies to do work just to have these meetings, right? But that being said, with early planning, oh, and then let's say about the patients, there's so many patients down in Latin America that either have rare diseases, have immune diseases, have cancer. I mean, that's sad, but that's the reality. And yet they don't have an opportunity to be in a clinical trial. So if there's early planning done, guarantee that the enrollment will happen. In our experience, we've had several clients where Latin America brought in that last 15 to 20% of the enrollment in both phase 2 and phase 3. So not just late trials, but also the phase 2 trials. And it was a critical piece because you weren't getting the numbers in the United States. And we all think we can all get the numbers with whatever we're doing in the moment. But if you add that Latin American piece early in the game, guarantee that you'll get really good recruitment.
Fantastic. Okay, just a few more questions here. They're coming in. So I think this is again for Sarah. Okay, so we are trying to recruit patients in other countries, but find that most patients don't want to engage, and we are struggling with lower enrollment numbers outside of the US. Maybe you should call us. No. Aside from working with doctors, how can we help build that trust up and educate patients about clinical research and studies,
Yeah.
especially once a study is already enrolling? We partner with sponsors to recruit patients so we don't have involvement before enrollment starts, unfortunately.
So yeah, I think this whole awareness of clinical trials has already started in a good way in the United States. Ex-US, there's a lot of work that's needed, like everywhere. And let's take Europe. Europe and the United States are pretty good, but if you look at the rest of the world, there's a real lack of awareness, lack of trust, lack of knowledge. And so we've developed, and I'm sure Anna has too with her sponsors, lots of materials that can be used to just put out there that are generic in the sense it's not study specific, it might be disease specific. And again, to develop that trust, it would be better to be working through either local doctors or the PIs who have a group of doctors that they can work with that therefore have access to those databases of patients. Once you're enrolling, it is always harder. But this is where you have to hire people like Anna's group or our group, because we can help find those patient advocacy groups that exist, especially in rare disease or in these rare oncology. And so I think those would be the simple answer.
Okay, going back to Anna for the last question here. Okay, how can we be sure that not only translation, but the language and the way the information is delivered will provide the subject with a good understanding of the study? An inclusion scenario would be important during the preparation of the study documents, such as the ICF and the site team that will support this person.
Well, I think it goes back to a lot of items which we discussed. It has to be a comprehensive approach. So the earlier you engage with a partner, the better it is, because sometimes the design of the documents can be done together, where we would provide you some information on what's the best opportunity on how to design the documents, how to write them in a certain way that it's clear to the patients. In many cases, documents now, of course, it doesn't involve the informed consent form, which is a legal document, but there is a lot of patient information which can be designed with multimedia. There is a lot of trials which are now administered through the mobile apps. There is a lot of animation which can be used in certain cases. There is a lot of information which can be distributed via the patient communities, right? Whether they are going to be a website about a certain disease or a community within the health center, which is servicing people with certain diseases, especially common diseases like diabetes, for example. All of those areas, when you take them into account and you bring them all to us, when you are planning your patient outreach and your recruitment, will help us have a better outcome with the documents.
I'd like to add one thing there, and that is, one of the stumbling blocks that I've seen time and time again with our clients is that they come in this desperate mode. Oh my God, I haven't gotten enrollment, whether it's a phase 2, phase 3, not so much phase 1, obviously, or of course, phase 4, but it's more the 2s and 3s, and they don't know what to do. And so it goes back to what Anna said, which is planning early. And one of the techniques that has worked really well, and that's more in the development stage, and that is the development of the protocol to get feedback from the outside. Every biotech and pharma always thinks they have all the expertise. It's just nature of the beast. But if you go out and ask patient advocacy groups, the actual PIs that have implemented other similar kinds of protocols, maybe they don't even need to be a site, but just get their feedback on some of those nitty-picky, difficult pieces that could be overcome early in the game, so that you're not on Amendment 7 by the time you're actually enrolling in some country, that you have that lined up early on, you've gotten that feedback early on from patients, from KOLs, and you've identified what the basic problems are, and then add the things that Anna's talking about, which is how do you reach these nuanced groups, whether they're an African American group, whether they're a Latino group, whether they're in global, to find out what their nuances are, what their patient advocacy groups are saying, what kind of challenges are they going to have in getting patients enrolled into these trials, because it's always about enrollment at the front end. So my point is to get feedback early in the development stage before you writing your 10th amendment, so that you can overcome some of these challenges before you even get started.
All right, fantastic. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And asking some really, really great questions here. If you haven't already checked it out, there are 2 handouts available for you to download. We have a white paper here, The Role Translation Plays in Recruitment and Retention from MorningSide. And then we also have a 1-pager PDF from Formacon Global on strategies to increase diversity in clinical trials. So we love to hear your feedback, but also there will be a recording sent to all of you following the webinar, so you can get your hands on that, share that with your colleagues. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us again. And feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any more questions or need some clarification. We're happy to answer, and we're happy to talk with all of you. Have a great day.
Thank you for participating.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everybody.